So I'm Dr. Louise Reid. I'm a geographer. I'm based at the University of St Andrews in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development. I'm also Director of the Centre for Housing Research there. And what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about my recent experiences on funded research projects, one by the Royal Society of Edinburgh around healthcare smart homes in Scotland, and before that, an ESRC fellowship looking at energy smart homes. So what I want to do today is just begin with some initial insights and reflections from critical social science about COVID-19 and its impacts. And I want to talk a little bit about how SMART has evolved over time within homes and housing, particularly drawing attention to energy and healthcare examples. And then I'm going to think about at the end what the implications are for this in the context or accelerated by COVID, but thinking beyond COVID in terms of housing policy. So on the slide there, I've just listed some key reflections that I've seen within very contemporary literature, online, social media about the nature of COVID. And these reflections are about COVID-19 and the impact on society generally, but they're also observations about the particular ways in which houses, homes and housing have been affected. So for instance, lockdown restrictions have confined us to our homes. In doing so, we've sort of had this renewal of heightened awareness about what home means, and it's also been reconfiguring relationships with what Edward Ralph famously called the irreplaceable centre of significance of our homes. For most, digital technologies have played a really central role in coping strategies, helping us to stay connected at home in the way that I am at the moment, via devices and infrastructure that have been enabled us to maintain virtual social contact. And geographers like me have over a long period of time now been, as part of this kind of move and concentration about home, have been really challenging quite nostalgic notions of home, questioning ideas of stability and autonomy, and in doing so revealing the sort of contingency, the tensions, the paradoxes of home. And these reflections on the slide here are part of that process. So this work has helped to shed light on how ideas of home are produced, by whom, for what purpose, and the variations in these experiences around the world over time. In fact, accounts of the diverse ways in which COVID-19 will shape experiences of home have been appearing, including, for instance, from Craig Gurney, who's also giving a presentation in this session. And I'd really encourage you to engage and watch that. But some of these accounts have been challenging and revealing sort of the very heteronormative, nation-based, race, class and gendered privileges within ideas and notions of the household and home. And also, we shouldn't forget that during COVID-19, many people don't have a home, and others, such as key workers, have stayed away from home. So throughout COVID-19, home and housing has been really central in how we've responded to COVID, and it'll continue to be central as we sort of emerge from the pandemic and deal with some of the legacy effects. So for instance, some of these very well-known authors such as Catherine Brickell have kind of talked about how the COVID pandemic isn't just a crisis in and of itself, but relates to much bigger ongoing crises, particularly in the UK, around housing security, for instance. Again, a recent editorial from the Radical Housing Journals talked about this idea of the kind of ongoing logic of mutual destruction and profit seeking, and how those have been perpetuated and intensified during COVID. And also recognition that actually life during COVID-19 hasn't been a uniform experience. So what these insights might mean, what that means on the ground is, and in practice, is really about inequality, appreciating and understanding inequality within society, but particularly within housing and policy context. And so some of the ways in which the housing sector has been challenged and changed, and many of you will be aware of this, is that increasingly we're thinking about multiple vulnerabilities of different groups of people and how those are manifest within the housing context. So for instance, people who are both fuel poor and food insecure, that can have a really profound effect on health and well-being, but of course in the way that they live their lives, where they live their lives, how they live their lives in the context of housing. We also know that COVID-19 has further exposed health inequalities. So the risk of serious illness is different for different people depending on what kind of socioeconomic group they are part of, where they live, what type of household they are part of. There's quite strong evidence around that. But these reflections about inequalities and how they've been perpetuated also comes at the same time when we get other data related to other aspects of housing, for instance from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, who've been talking about a COVID-19 post-lockdown property boom, where there's an increasing appetite and desire to perhaps live in rural, remote areas, to be able to spend more time outdoors and out of cities, and that with an improvement in digital infrastructure, which has been ongoing for a long time, this might extenuate increased desire and capacity to live and work remotely. And that also obviously has consequences for housing policy in terms of where people may want to live in the future and what types of places they want to live in. So I want to talk a little bit about, and this will be the majority of the presentation, thinking about how SMART fits into that broader context of COVID and its impacts. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about SMART in the context of energy. So according to the latest UK government figures, 20.5 million gas and electricity smart meters have been installed in UK homes. Obviously, this installation rates have dropped during COVID as people have been unable, installers have been unable to access homes. But this has been a huge strategic UK government policy ambition. In 2012, the UK government announced that smart meters must be fitted in all homes and businesses by the end of 2019. Now, there's been a bit of slippage on this, and energy suppliers have until mid-2025 to do that. But the idea and the ambition is still there. Smart meters, part of the reason for that is that smart meters offer the possibility of automated readings every 30 minutes, giving an overview of how much energy is used in the home, and with that, the promise of added convenience and cost saving for householders. So all of that data is collected by energy companies. And the idea is that if we have this information and we are able to change the way in which we use energy, there are clear climate benefits to that and energy security benefits to that. What I'm most interested in that is the data and what the data might make possible and how we think about that data in the context of housing policy more generally, but also the experience of homes and of housing. So the availability of this data, particularly the frequency of 30-minute readings, offers a really different way for thinking about the home and how interventions may occur to meet a vast range of policy goals. For instance, we can put in smart meters on the basis of thinking about improving energy efficiency, about energy security, in order to meet a range of climate change commitments, and more recently, some of the really interesting discussions about how that data may be used for healthcare purposes. And I think this is really important for us to think about this from a housing perspective, partly because this is data that happens within houses, it's collected within houses and affects the people who live there, but also because there may be even broader applications for thinking about this type of data, how it may be used, and therefore quite significant implications. So this last point about healthcare and the potential synergies between smart meters and domestic energy concerns more generally is what I want to concentrate on. With COVID-19, we're all really aware that healthcare services have been under acute pressure, but this is part of a longer trend, particularly with an ageing population, which has complex healthcare needs. The desire to enable, for instance, ageing at home and has been a really long-standing policy objective, particularly in Scotland. But with COVID-19 and the requirement to stay at home, the desire from healthcare from afar has really exploded. So for instance, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Near Me, but that is an NHS platform where patients meet with clinicians remotely, and there's an example of Jason Leach doing one of those appointments. So they've recently celebrated achieving more than 500,000 appointments in Scotland, and the rollout took place this year. It was planned anyway, and COVID has accelerated it. But they moved from about 300 consultations a month to 18,000, and NHS Near Me is now used in every NHS health board in Scotland. So that kind of gives a bit of a taste of the direction of change and the way in which increasingly healthcare is not just confined to hospitals, for instance, but is really coming into our homes. And that's not a recent phenomenon, but it's certainly something that's been accelerated with COVID and the improvements in digital infrastructure. Moreover, consumer devices such as Alexa, Google Home, Hive, Zoom, Ring doorbells, indoor CCTV, that are really quite readily available, affordable, fairly intuitive to use, have potentially significant implications when used at home, not least for concerns around work-life balance, gender issues, and importantly, new regimes of observability, domestic routines and practices. So my own anecdotal observations from looking at different charities and organisations, what they've been saying, but also looking at accounts on social media of people themselves privately purchasing these types of equipment and what they're using them for, reveal that the use of consumer devices has really accelerated during COVID. And that they're used to enable care from afar, for instance, to help a family member do an online shop or to manage their heating systems, to monitor their movements within the home or to check who's at somebody's door. They've really accelerated hugely during this pandemic. As I said before, it's not necessarily a new trend, it's something that's been happening for a while, but it's the acceleration of that, which is something I think is interesting for us to reflect on. So for instance, organisations such as NHS Digital for a while now have been providing advice on digital solutions for those to support informal caring. You may have seen adverts on the TV by the RNIB and Alzheimer's Scotland, where particularly the RNIB, there was an advert of a blind person using Amazon to get the weather forecast. And the extent to which these phenomena or the kind of devices, infrastructure supplement and provide a substitute for in-person visits and how they sort of intersect with existing domestic or caring routines and importantly shape experiences of home and of housing are key questions for policy, I think. Returning to the idea of smart meters, several organisations have actually been exploring how and in which ways smart meter data can actually be used for healthcare purposes in and over the things that I've outlined so far. So an example there on the slide from the Smart Energy GB Twitter account about how smart meters could help us care for loved ones. That's a really huge area at the moment of discussion, debate and attention, which I think perhaps hasn't been engaged with in a substantive way by housing policy overall. So the idea here is that energy use data may be used to detect changes in patterns of activity within a home and used to inform healthcare interventions. For instance, if we accept Rick's data about COVID property boom, it might be that as people move to more remote and rural areas because of COVID, that it might be reasonable actually to anticipate that there'll be greater demand for remote healthcare at home via smart methods. So just last week, 2020 Health and Independent Social Enterprise think tank published a report highlighting exactly how an upgraded energy system with smart meters at its heart could transform the way we care for most vulnerable people at home. The table on the slide there has been drawn from that report, and what it shows is some of the ways in which energy smart meter data could be used for a number of different healthcare services. For instance, energy use patterns can be linked to health status, to health changes and general well-being. In fact, a key area which has been hailed as having a lot of promise and therefore receiving a lot of attention is the way in which the data can be used to monitor patterns of household electricity consumption via the use of appliances such as toasters, microwaves, ovens, kettles, washing machines. And that from that data, machine learning processes can build a map of our everyday routine behaviours over time thereby detecting when they change and using that change or unexpected change in activity or inactivity to indicate a change in health and result in some form of intervention. It's important to note, as the report itself does, that health and care research using smart energy data is really at an early stage, and this is why I don't think energy policy necessarily is aware of this or has engaged with this. For instance, the first clinical trial using the approach was only conducted in 2016, and it's ongoing in the UK, Australia, Austria, Japan, and Sweden. I think the kind of idea of using smart meter data for healthcare purposes, especially given the context of COVID, is unlikely to diminish. And I think the potential scalability is huge. The high spatial and temporal resolution of the data would give us insights into everyday life within homes that we just never thought possible a decade ago. Clearly, there are important safeguarding concerns here. And as somebody who's interested in this from a housing context, I think it's really important that housing policy is also involved in these discussions. So how are these future homes anticipated? By whom? For what purpose? I mean, after all, these phenomenon activities will impact on how we live our lives, how we see homes change in the future, and what types of technologies and infrastructures are required. And I think it's really critical to get to grips with the sort of lived experience of this. So whilst the use of mainstream devices for informal care may have been used during COVID-19 to replace in-person visits or to provide connection and reassurance, these may themselves create legacy effects in terms of creating a new reliance on technology, on new routines of observation, and on changed relationships with home and with housing. So I think it's really critical that we interrogate how relations within technology-enabled care, which we often call it, have changed, in which ways, why, and how this varies for different places for different people. So experience is really key here. One nice example, which I've got on the slide there, of highlighting the importance of understanding lived experience and of people who are in homes, was highlighted through a study run by Citizens Advice, who commissioned the Energy Systems Catapult to complete a specific in-trial activity during January and February last year, 2019. What they did was they investigated consumer understanding of a novel energy-saving energy service, and really what they tried to get to grips with were the sort of consumer expectations around payment and data sharing. And I think this is really important because it helps to highlight some of the broader concerns we may have within the smart context and the use of energy data for healthcare purposes or other purposes within the home. So via the sort of living lab study, the investigators identified 4 key risks, as I've listed in the slide. And perhaps most significant amongst these was that there was evidence that the problems with the service may only emerge as the service is used and over the longer term. So we can't necessarily always anticipate what the problems and concerns are with those in terms of how they're experienced and how they're used. And that's a really insightful thing for us to reflect on and think about when we're thinking about future interventions or future use of data within the home. I think the report concludes, as I put on the bottom there, that it's key, therefore, that the energy sector develops the capability to test and learn how to design smarter protection based on real experiences. And I think this conclusion reflects those in energy studies more broadly, that domestic practices and activities change over time, as inevitably technologies and cultural meanings do, but that this variation may be more or less energy intensive. And I think that reflection of the literature demonstrates the importance of experience and recognises that performance does not always meet design. That is, there's a gap between how services, infrastructure, technologies, homes, housing are designed and how they perform. So the experience of housing and home, therefore, really needs to be forefront in discussions of the move towards smart meters in general, but also in their use for healthcare purposes. So why is this important for housing? In trying to make sense of this and bring it all together, what I want to do is explore the potential significance of these issues for housing. First of all, I'm not dismissing all of smart technologies and interventions. I think there are many potential benefits to these developments, and I recognise also that COVID, I think, will accelerate many of these trends and the desire and capacity for them. But I think we need to remain careful and considered in terms of thinking through how they may be used, to what end, by whom, and what the effects of that may be. So I started this presentation reflecting on what some critical social scientists have been alerting us to in terms of the impacts of COVID. And just to reiterate, we know that COVID has simply been further exposing housing and health inequalities. The technological solutionism which smart homes offer, smart meters offer, will not on its own help us to overcome these challenges. In fact, in my view, there's a danger that might further perpetuate them. So we need to be really, really careful in these developments. So some reflections then to conclude. I think much of the research on smart homes, and specifically around the utility of smart home data to help achieve policy goals, for instance, those related to healthcare, but also potentially to housing, have been quite limited, both in terms of the number of studies, but also the way in which the experience has been captured. For obvious reasons, many of these have been studies of homes where there's only a single occupant. Moreover, there's concerns that I and many others have around the issues of consent and the capacity of people to give consent for data to be used for monitoring, particularly if capacity may change over time. And also concerns about the kind of idea or reliance on a wider network of trusted individuals or first responders who may be involved in intervening if, for instance, changes are detected in patterns of activities. So if we have healthcare interventions on the basis of smart home data, smart energy data, what might that mean for the housing sector? Does it mean in social housing, for instance, that providers have some role? Is there a role for the housing regulator? And how do these issues differ across different housing sectors? For instance, maybe across different tenures, they may be manifest in different ways. Maybe across the housing supply and construction industry, they manifest in different ways. So I think we need to really be careful about and start to interrogate some of these relations and think about what they may mean for housing. I think we need to be reflecting on who's involved. So, as I said, thinking about the whole housing chain, thinking about designers to users, and particularly about the lived experience of many of these phenomena. I think we also need to be considering the type of housing, whether or not that's new build, retrofit, thinking about broader housing and other types of infrastructure, so digital infrastructure and how those interact. And I think thinking about how housing itself interacts with these other services around healthcare and energy, and thinking about what that may be like in the future, and importantly, what form it should take. So I've put some reflections on the slide there, but I think the key thing is, I mean, I don't think I have all of the answers. I don't really think any of us do, but I think we need to be clear about what the key questions are, specifically as they relate to housing in this context. So that's all I wanted to say, really. It's been great to be given the opportunity to record some of my thoughts and to document them in this way. I'm grateful clearly to the funders who've helped fund my work, but I'd be really interested in following up on any of this. So my contact details are on the last slide there. Feel free to drop me an email and we can continue discussions another time. Thank you very much.